Welcome again to today's webinar, which is making your Talis Aspire rollover a pain-free process. For those of you that don't know me, my name is David Renfrey. I'm a senior customer success consultant working for Technology from Sage, and I will be presenting today's webinar. So for those of you who haven't attended before, this is actually an annual webinar which we run every year. And we always do it around this time of year because although we do actually offer multiple rollover options in Talis Aspire, and we'll look at those shortly, we do know that the majority of universities using the system, certainly those in the UK, roll over the majority of their lists from around now, mid-May, till sometime in August. It's what we call rollover season. So hopefully the timing of this webinar is good and fits in neatly with your plans. So the content is broadly similar to last year, although there are a couple of changes which we will need to address as we go through. Obviously, we have support documentation on our website around rollover, but this session really serves as a refresher for those of you that haven't had to think about rollover for 12 months. Or if you've never managed to roll over in your institution and this is your first time, then this is your chance to have an introduction of everything that's involved. We have actually allocated an extra half hour this year. Last year, there were many questions and we ran over slightly. And I do know that some of you will have meetings to get to straight after this session. So the expectation is that looking at the rollover of lists within the system should take us to around the hour, so about 3 o'clock. And then we will look over the rollover of scans as well after that. So if you're not using Talis Aspire copyright clearance or our DCS integration, then you can actually drop off the session at that point. So what will we be looking at today? We will be looking at the different ways you can roll over. So there is bulk rollover and targeted rollover within Talis Aspire reading lists. There will be a short demonstration of those different routes to actually rolling over your lists. We will talk a little bit about reviews and how they are impacted by rolling over and any sort of housekeeping you might need to do within your system. We'll be looking at what rollover means for your LTI launch links, and that's a little bit more complex than it used to be because some of you are now on 1.3 and some of you are still on the older standard. We will pause for questions at that point, but do drop questions into the chat as we go. And I will either look to address them as they come in or when I pause at that point in the session. We will then look at rolling over in Talis Aspire copyright clearance. We'll also talk briefly about rolling over with regards to the DCS integration. But actually, most of the action where that is concerned actually happens within the DCS. So there's not too much to say. Again, there will be a demonstration of how that works in practice, and that then we will pause for questions at the end. So that's what we're looking to cover over the next 90 minutes or so. So let's start by considering the different ways you can roll over. So there is what we call bulk rollover, and there is what we call targeted rollover. So bulk rollover is the method that almost all of you are already using, or traditional rollover, or whatever you want to call it. Those of you with long memories who have been using Talis Aspire for a long time will know that there was a time when it was the only rollover method that was available to you. But essentially, it's when you look to roll all of your lists from a particular time period into a new one without any exceptions. So what we'll be looking at over the next few slides is, well, why would you choose to do this? What are the benefits of rolling over? We'll look at choices you can make around your time periods within the system. We'll look at some of the decisions you need to make because rollover is a flexible process and you do have some options as to how it's actually managed within the system. We will look at any preparation you might need to do ahead of your rollover. So not necessarily internally to Talis Aspire, but also externally to your wider institution, people that will be impacted by rollover. Then we will give you a demonstration of how it actually works in practice, and then I will pause for questions. So the first question why rollover at all? What are the benefits of rollover? So we will look at time periods. We will look at linking to the VLE. We will look at what this means for library acquisitions. We will look at what this means for digitizations. So yeah, there's an awful lot of benefits, reasons why you might want to roll over your reading lists. With regards to time periods, it's really helpful if you can differentiate between different versions of a reading list in different academic sessions. So you might be using full years, so 21-22 rolls over to 22-23, rolls over to 23-24, and so on. Or you might be using semesters or terms. It's also really helpful with regards to linking to the VLE. So underneath each of the time periods that you have set up is a thing called a slug. I don't name these things. And it's a unique identifier for that time period, which your VLE will then be able to hook into and ensure that it makes a better match when pulling through the correct list when your instructors are trying to link lists into the VLE. So if you're not rolling over, they're probably going to have to choose from more different versions of lists when choosing the correct one. It has benefits for library staff in that when you do a rollover, it's quite possible at the same time you're updating student numbers, either through the hierarchy or directly on the lists. It also means that any list that's been rolled over and updated, you can be sure that what's on there is actually the current reading. And you're not having to check when it was last edited, and are these things that have been added since I last seen, do they relate to this academic year or are they older? So it's really just a chance to sort of do that review every year. It's also just a good way of sort of prodding, your academics and ensuring that what you've actually got there is current. So, you can sort of reflect on the resources in use and, send out messages to your academics along the lines of, we have now created the new version of your reading list. Please review the content and update as required. So it's a chance for reflection to ensure that what you have in the system is actually current. If you're using digitizations within the service, either DCS integration or our own copyright clearance, you'll know that your digitizations can only go up for 12 months at a time, because that's what the CLA sort of mandates. So it's also a chance to, at the same time as you renew the scan, actually renew the list that it's attached to. And it does have benefits for analytics in that you'll know every list within the system has an analytics dashboard attached. When you carry out a rollover and you create a new list, that dashboard will reset itself so that you can do year-on-year comparisons between how many hits did it have last year, how many did it have last year, the year before, and you're not constantly having to drill down into those numbers to say, well, actually, how many of these visits came in the last 6 months or whatever. So there are many reasons there why we think rollover has benefits in terms of the LTI, in terms of the scans, in terms of your internal processes. Having said all of that, we do work with a handful of institutions, I think it's about 7 or 8, who actually choose not to roll over their lists, who have put other sort of arrangements in place to manage this process from year to year. And essentially, we just update their time periods at a time that they ask us to. The main reason for doing this, certainly if you go back a few years, was an issue with relinking lists after rollover due to the limitations of our previous LTI specs. But now that a lot of you have moved to LTI 1.3, I think we've sort of done away with the main argument for not choosing to roll over. And so for all the reasons given here, we do recommend that you do actually roll your lists over from year to year. But if it is something where you think, well, actually, we've got a good case where we think maybe we don't need to, raise a support ticket. We will have a conversation with you about it. So let's look at some of those advantages. We mentioned time periods first. Why would you use time periods at all? So it's often useful, or actually it's actually a requirement at some institutions, that you keep a record of the different versions of resource lists that you've had to teach a course or a module or a unit over time. So you might have students who are currently in level 3, they are approaching their finals, they might want to return to the precise reading for a course they took 2 or 3 years ago in level 1. You can also use it to reassure your currently enrolled students that the resources they're viewing right now are the most up-to-date ones because there is some sort of time period message at the top of the list, indicating this is the current academic year. We also know that they can be quite useful when you have students who perhaps have an appeal or are doing a resit and they need access to the reading list for that particular course as it appeared at the time that they were taking it. So, you know, that's some of the reasons why you might have time periods within your system and why you then need to roll between them. And they work by allowing you to label a list with a predefined time title. So the screenshot I've got on screen here, you can see is just set up fairly traditionally. I'm currently creating a list. I can choose from 23-24 or 24-25. But you do have a lot of flexibility with how you set time periods up. So you could have years, you could have terms, you could have semesters, and you can have time periods that run concurrently. So a common thing that we see is that an institution might have, say, a 24-25 time period, but they might also have a time period that runs roughly alongside it because the medical school keeps to a different calendar. Or in my previous institution, we had an education school, but the PGCE course didn't quite follow the same term dates as the other courses did. So having those time periods sort of helps to differentiate when those lists are needed for. And it just means that, you know, everything keeps in sync and it helps you use the same terminology. And that's how easy it is to select a time period when you're creating a list. You just put in your details and you select it from the drop down. So before a rollover, you will need time periods in place. A lot of you have been doing this already over the last 2 or 3 weeks, and I suspect we will see some more tickets after this call as a result of what we're telling you now. But before you can do a rollover, you will need time periods for the next academic year in place so that you've got somewhere for your current list to roll over into. You can do that via a support ticket. This may possibly be the last year that you actually have to do this step of the process, because as some of you know, we're currently sort of building in more and more features into that settings area of Talis Aspire, where you can actually control settings within the system yourself. And we know that some of you are keen to have control over time periods yourself. So that is something we are actively looking at. However, that's not available right now. So for this year, if you haven't already and you need a time period set up ahead of your rollover, do raise a support ticket. Give us the details of what the time period should be called. We also cannot set up a time period without a start and end date. So do have that in mind. You know, if you're going to raise a ticket asking for a 24-25 time period, can you also tell us when that time period needs to run from and when it needs to run to? If you're not sure which dates you've used in previous years, do ask on the support ticket and we can check your tenancy settings and we can tell you. When you are raising that support ticket, asking for a time period, it's also useful to let us know which date you are planning to roll over. And the reason we say that is because theoretically, if we had, say, 5 or 6 institutions all looking to roll over on the same day, that could cause us an issue with like strain on the servers. I say theoretically because this is now my 7th summer of supporting universities with rollovers, and we haven't yet actually said to anybody, no, you can't roll over on that date. So, you know, if we've got 2, 3, 4 universities all rolling over on the same day, it's not a problem. But do let us know, and then we can mark it in our calendar, and we've got a sense of who's rolling over and when. Before you carry out your rollover, it's also a good idea to send out communications to your list publishers, so all of your academics. Again, we know that a lot of institutions do this by going into the all users report, filtering it to people that have the list publisher role, and then exporting that report and taking all the email addresses and, you know, send out a communication saying rollover will be happening on this date. We ask you not to make any edits to your list while this is taking place, that sort of thing. It might be a good idea to put a message on your Talis Aspire homepage, so you'll know that underneath the search box on the main page, there is an option for you to put some text. So again, a common thing we see is a university will highlight in red, you know, rollover will be taking place on this date. Please do not make any changes to lists, etc., etc. It's also a good idea ahead of your rollover to actually go into the all lists report. So you're doing a bit of housekeeping now. and identifying any lists in your current time period which are either still in draft or have been published but have unpublished changes. And the reason you do that is when you start a rollover process running, what will get rolled over is the published version of the list as seen by the students at the moment. So if you've got a lecturer who's created a list and they've never got around to publishing it, so it's sat there in draft, when you carry out your rollover, that list will not get rolled over. It will still sit there in the background. The same thing goes if you've got an academic who has a list that's available to students, they've added a couple of additional items to it, but they've forgotten to hit the publish button. When the list is rolled over, those changes that they have made will not be carried over. So it's a good thing to do from a housekeeping point of view to go into the all lists report, look at your current time period, set the filters to draft or published with unpublished changes, and identify some lists where some housekeeping might be required. And that might mean chasing up the lecturer in question and saying, did you want this kept live? Do you need these changes kept? Another good piece of housekeeping you can do before the rollover is to go into the list copy actions report. So what the list copy actions report allows you to do is to identify where somebody has created a list by copying an existing one. So there's a couple of reasons you might want to do this. Perhaps you've set up your time period for next year already. You've got a lecturer who is being unusually opportunistic, who has said, I've got time to start on my reading list for next year. They've copied the 23-24 list, they've created a 24-25 version, and they've started editing, not realizing that you haven't carried out your rollover yet, and that when you roll that list over, you're then going to have duplicate versions of that list floating about. So you can use the list copy actions report to see if anyone has carried out something like that. It's also useful because if you are using scans within your system, either through copyright clearance or DCS integration, then when a user requests a scan from a list, obviously that goes into your digitization area. And then effectively there is a chain between that list item and the scan that they have requested. And I'll show you this more clearly on a slide in a few minutes' time. If a user then copies a list and starts making edits rather than rolling it over through the traditional way, what they've effectively done is they've broken that chain between the scan and the item in the list. And so again, you're going to need to go in and either make re-request items or say to them, no, can you please make your edits in the version we're about to roll over, that sort of thing. So there's housekeeping you can do ahead of the rollover. You can use all lists to identify lists which need changes publishing, and you can use the list copy actions report to identify if anyone has copied a list and may have upset the digitization workflow or has created a duplicate list. Rollover is designed to be flexible, to allow you to build a workflow that's going to work for you. So you do have some decisions to make internally about how your rollover should be managed. First thing you're going to need to ask yourself is, when do you actually want to carry out the rollover? So as I said in the introduction to the webinar, we're entering what we call rollover season, which goes from about now till the middle of August. So we have universities who are rolling over right now or next week. We have universities who won't be rolling over until August. I am not here to tell you which of those is the right or wrong approach, because it depends on your institution. A common approach that we see is that institutions will tie in the rollover of Talis Aspire with their VLE. So it might be worth liaising with your Blackboard team or your Canvas team or whoever and saying, when are you going to be rolling over? We will roll over Talis Aspire at around the same time. And it means that your lecturers, when they've got access to their new VLE course, can then start work on their reading list at the same sort of time. Again, it may depend on your term dates. There is an argument for going early and giving your lecturers maximum time to actually update their lists before they go on summer leave. Because, of course, if they're making changes to their lists and adding new items that you need to order, that gives you maximum time to order them over the summer break in time for the next academic year. Or you might want to roll over later. You might decide that actually our lecturers are too busy with marking. They're not going to look at this right now. So we'll go later in the summer when they've returned from leave, and then we will look to roll over and catch them when they come back. So there's no right or wrong answer to that. It's really what's going to fit in with your VLE team's plans, with your academic calendar. You also have the choice of whether to roll your newly created lists over to draft or to published. And again, there are pros and cons for either approach. It's really about what you feel more comfortable with. So there is an argument that rolling over to draft prompts your academics to do some work. So you've rolled the list over to draft. It's not visible to the students for next year yet. And so basically, you're forcing them to say, yep, I'm going to look at my list. Even if there are no changes required, I've looked at it, I've decided that that's how it should be, and I've hit the publish button. So yeah, you're not putting anything in front of the students that hasn't been approved by the lecturer. That's the sort of pro argument. The con argument, of course, is that you may find that you get to 2 or 3 weeks before teaching, you still have 200 or 300 lists in draft. What are you going to do at this point? Are you going to chase the lecturers and make them make their updates? Or are you just going to bulk publish them anyway, thinking that a list in front of students is better than no list at all? So yeah, there's a good argument for it in that the students don't see anything that hasn't been approved, but you might be saving up some work for yourself later. The alternative approach is to publish all of your lists as soon as you do rollover, so they're available for students to view straight away. If you have a time period which doesn't start until, say, September, there will be a clear message at the top of the list saying, this time period does not start until September. So it should be clear to your students that this is next year's list. But again, what are you going to do with your academics who haven't engaged? You can run reports every week in the All Lists area to identify which newly created lists haven't actually been touched. But yeah, you still might have to do some chasing if no one has actually taken any action against any of those lists. So yeah, it's kind of up to you which you think is the best approach to doing this. I would say the split between how universities do it is roughly 50-50. Some of you roll to draft, some of you roll to published, and it's really what you think is going to work best for you. At the point of rollover, you also have a decision to make, and we'll see all of this in the demo in a few minutes. Are you going to archive your existing lists or not? And again, there are good arguments for doing this or not doing this. It may also depend when exactly you are carrying out your rollover. So certainly you could argue that archiving them immediately gives you a clean slate for the next academic year, because by archiving those lists, they're not going to be visible to your students. So the moment you've rolled over, all of your 23-24 lists have disappeared from the Talis Aspire setup. Although having said that, if you've got any LTI links in place, they will still point at that version of the list in the current year's VLE. However, if you're rolling over quite early in the summer, there might be an argument to be made that you shouldn't archive the list at the point of rollover because you still may have students using them. They may want access to them during the exam period. They may want access to them in July or August if they are doing resits. So again, it's really sort of what you feel most comfortable with. You can choose to archive them and hide them from students immediately, or you can keep them up for a while, relying on the time period messages at the top of the list to make it clear to students this is last year's or this is next year's or whatever. And then you do have the ability to archive all of those lists in bulk at a later date. And I did mention this on the last slide, but I'll mention it again. Do remember to tell your list publishers what you're up to. Let them know we will be rolling over Talis Aspire on this date. Please do not make any edits to lists on this date because any changes you make may potentially be lost. We do actually know of 1 or 2 institutions who will raise a ticket with us ahead of rollover, and they will actually ask us to remove the edit list permission from list publishers a few days before the rollover. That then allows them to do their housekeeping on the list, so all of the things I mentioned on the last slide. And then once the rollover is complete, they will ask us to reinstate the edit list permission. for list publishers. So again, that's something you might want to consider if you're really worried about people making edits during the rollover process. And so your timeline might look something like this. And thank you to the University of Worcester, who's provided this for us several years ago, and we're still using it because it seems like a pretty good approach to us in terms of how to manage your rollover. So agree a rollover date with your VLE team, with your library colleagues, raise a support ticket with Talis, telling us which time periods you would like in place and when you are planning on doing your rollover. What Worcester also do, they actually import their modules for the new academic year into Talis Aspire, into the hierarchy in advance of the rollover. It's a good idea to do this if you have access to the data, but we know that not every institution does. And bear in mind that the hierarchy doesn't have any sort of concept of a time period. So you can do this after if you don't immediately have that information to hand. But essentially what they are doing is making sure their hierarchy is in place as well, so that when lists are rolled over, that's going to be accurate for the new year as well. But if you do it just after the rollover or before teaching starts, that should be fine as well. They send out communications in advance of the rollover. So, this is when it's happening. This is what you need to do. They do also send a reminder to staff the day before because, people forget. Things get lost in inboxes. So if you're rolling over on the Friday, maybe send a final email reminder on the Thursday. And that would, explain this is what rollover is. Please don't edit lists. We will be in touch again when rollover is complete. And they also update the homepage message on Talis Aspire. And then, as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, they spend some time looking at the all list report and the list copy actions report, identifying lists that are in draft that have unpublished changes and making any necessary updates prior to rollover. Once the rollover is complete, there's some more actions carried out. So it's a good idea to update your staff to confirm, yep, the rollover is now complete. Here is what we need from you. Please, could you update your lists? Often universities will give them a date saying something like, if you haven't updated your lists by 31st of July, the library cannot guarantee that any items you've added to them will be in stock available for the start of teaching. That's the sort of thing you would put in a post-rollover communication. It's also a good point to remind academics what the library can do for them in terms of support with Talis Aspire. So something we hear often from you guys when we're talking to you on customer success calls is that academics only log into Talis Aspire once a year. By the time they come back 12 months later, they've forgotten what they did last year and how it works. So just after you've done your rollover, it's a good opportunity for you to actually reach out and offer training sessions or one-to-ones or however you manage that within your institution. But, they've now got something that they need to action because the list has been rolled over. This is the perfect time to have those conversations. And then there is a process over the next few weeks after the rollover. So checking on the student registry system that the modules that they've put in place in the hierarchy are indeed correct, adding any new ones, removing any that it turns out aren't running after all. And it is possible to run an all lists report every week to identify which lists have been updated, which ones have still not been touched, and who do we need to reach out to make sure that they are updating their lists for the next year. So how you would do that, you would go to the all list report and you would do something like time period 24-25, published in the last week, or which ones are still sitting in draft. So that's a report you could run every week to see the progress of who's actually made the necessary changes after the rollover. One more slide, and then I'll stop talking theory and we'll actually have a look at how this works in practice. So, as I said, nearly all of you are using the bulk rollover, which is like the rollover process that's been available from day one within Talis Aspire. We have actually had this targeted rollover option available, and this has been in the system for about 4 or 5 years now. And what it allows you to do is be more sort of, well, literally targeted in which lists you choose to roll over and when. So it might be, we talked about different time periods for different courses that are running, but it might be that you've got one time period and you're just choosing to roll over selected courses as and when they come up. So, for instance, maybe you might want to roll over your business school lists at a particular point because they follow different term dates, and you'll roll over the others at a later date. Maybe you just want to roll over your PGCE lists because they're not following the same calendar as the rest of the education courses, and you'll roll the education courses over later. So you do have the ability to roll over only selected lists at any given time. You can do that via the All Lists report, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment. And just a reminder on this slide, you can only roll a list over once. So one of the concerns that people have about targeted rollover is, well, if I'm selecting specific lists to roll over at a certain time, how can I make sure I don't accidentally roll them over again? And the answer is you can't, because the system will only allow you to roll over any given list once. So there's no danger of you accidentally rolling over the same items multiple times. So that is your alternative to the bulk rollover process. I am monitoring the chat, by the way, but I can't see that anything has come in yet. So what I'm going to do at this point, I'm actually going to sort of, we've talked a lot about the comms you need to send, considerations you need to make. It'll be easier at this point if we actually just show you how the process works. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to do this via video, and I'm not doing it via live. And the reason for that is because whenever you submit a rollover to us, it joins a central queue for processing. And so there's always the danger that if I try and demo rollover live and someone else is running a rollover job right now, it won't actually start here and now. So that's why I've chosen to do it this way. That's another reason why we ask you to let us know your rollover date, because if there are multiple institutions rolling over on the same day, you may actually find that your rollover doesn't actually start immediately. But I'll talk a bit more about that as we go through the demo. So the first thing we'll look at, this is the bulk rollover. This is rolling over all of the lists from one time period to the next. And this is the one that I think the majority of you are actually following. So let me make this full screen. So what's happening here? We're going to the admin menu. And as you can probably guess, we are going to choose request time period rollover. So what's going on this screen? I do actually think there's quite a good explanation on the right-hand side here. So we do actually tell you within the system, how should I use this page? This will locate all published lists in a specified source time period and create an exact copy assigned to the specified target period. So it's literally taking all the lists from your source time period and creating new ones in the target time period. It's also worth that bit I'm just highlighting there now as well. This is a long running job, and once submitted, progress can be reviewed from review jobs, which we'll look at in a moment. Jobs are not picked up and processed immediately, but you can expect jobs to complete within 48 hours of requests. So again, this comes back to this idea of there is a central queue that they go into. If no one else is rolling over when you start the process, you should expect your rollover to start straight away. If somebody else is rolling over at the point that you started yours, you may find that it doesn't get picked up immediately and it doesn't start processing for an hour or two. But there is a message which I'll show you in a moment, and you'll see that when we get that, we have got it. You don't need to raise a ticket asking us what's happened. It does say within 48 hours of request. To be honest, that's largely there to cover ourselves. I would be quite concerned if you found that your rollover took 48 hours. In reality, it should be much faster than that, and we will talk about rates in a moment. So what's going on here? We are choosing the source time period. This is the time period which I want to roll over. So 23, 24. The target time period, this is the one which I have set up via support ticket, and this is where I want my new reading lists to appear. So all of 23, 24 to be copied over into the new time period. You can see there are the options underneath. So you can decide at this point, do I want my new list to be draft or do I want them to be published? And I also have my choice at this point. Do I want to archive the old lists and remove them from the hierarchy, or do I want to keep them in place? So if I don't want to archive at this point, I'm going to leave that box blank. So those are the decisions I'm able to make at this point. For this one, I decided I wanted to publish my new lists. I wasn't archiving. So when you click on next step, it doesn't start immediately. We're basically giving you a review of what you're about to do. So this is your last chance to back out if you're not sure. So we have a source time period and a target time period. The system has confirmed that the new lists will be published. There's a message here. Currently, there are 8 published lists assigned to the source time period. So you should have an idea of how many lists you're looking to roll over. This will sort of confirm that for you. There is one list under review linked to this time period, which will also be rolled over. And we'll talk about reviews and rollover in a moment. This line often confuses people. The actual amount of lists rolled over may vary depending on when the job actually executes. So what that means is there are currently 8 published lists assigned to the source time period. Almost certainly, we are going to end up rolling over 8 lists. But what this sort of line is warning you about is that let's say you submit this to roll over and it doesn't start for a couple of hours because there's another job happening somewhere else. If that were to happen, and in those 2 hours, maybe, I don't know, someone creates a new list that sits in this time period, or someone archives one of these 8 lists so that it's no longer live, this figure may change slightly. I don't think it's likely to be a big issue for most of you, but just to confirm, that's what this line means. It means that this figure up here could change if there are lists newly created or deleted between you hitting the button and the job actually starting. And then finally, it says, click request rollover to submit a rollover job. Once submitted, the job cannot be revoked or undone. So that is your final warning. You know, once you've hit the button, it's going to go through. But yeah, there's your target time period, confirmation of what you're doing, confirmation of number of lists affected, warning message about a review, which, as I say, we'll come on to in a moment. And then that warning about the number of lists actually being rolled over. So when we're happy with all of that, we are going to hit the request rollover button. So what's going to happen now? It's taken you to the review job screen. You can see we've got a status of requested. Once you see that message in this screen, we've got it. So as I say, if you find that it doesn't immediately start processing, but takes a little while before it gets going, don't panic. If you see this message here requested, we have got the rollover job. It has hit our queues and we will be able to process it. Now, obviously, that's going to run for a while. You can actually check your progress as it's going. So I only rolled over a small list, a number of lists here. You're probably going to be rolling over hundreds or thousands rather than 8. But you can actually go to that screen and show the details. And so you can see in this case, 2 had already completed, there were 6 that were queued. So you get a sense of how far along your job is. And then obviously that might take a few hours depending on how long your job is. But when it's complete, you'll see a message like that that says complete success. And then if you go to the action menu, it will actually show you the details of what happened when you hit the rollover button. So in this case, there were 8 child jobs, all 8 of them completed. There were no errors, there were no failures. What you've also got on this screen is this unique key at the top. So if for any reason you do find that there are errors or failures and you're not sure what the problem was, do raise a support ticket with us and do quote this unique key that you see in this rollover area, because that is like an identifier for the rollover job that you submitted. Our tech team can then go into that job using the key you've provided, and they can see what the problem might be. So rollover is usually pretty smooth, but if you do have any problems, quote us that key. That makes it easier for us to investigate as to what might have happened. And as far as your part of the process goes, that's it. That's how the rollover works. I still can't see any questions, which surprises me. So I'm hoping people can still hear me. Okay, let me just go back to the slideshow. Just bear with me a moment. Okay, thumbs up from Emily. Thank you, Emily. I know I'm not talking to myself. The other rollover option that we offer is the targeted rollover, which is when you select only particular lists that you want to roll over at any given time. There's a question from Evelyn. If an academic has copied a list in advance of rollover, would you just archive the list they don't want for next year? Probably, yes. I guess it would depend how far they got with the list that they copied for next year. If they've done all the work of it, perhaps you'll need to archive the one that you've rolled over instead. But yeah, probably just worth having a quick chat with them and working out which one you want to keep going forwards. So the targeted rollover is the one that gives you more flexibility if you don't want to roll everything over in one go for different term dates or whatever. And this is how this process works. So again, we have a video which I'm going to talk over to show you how this works. You can do this from the all lists report. And so I guess most of you are familiar with the all lists report. You'll know that it's a report that basically allows you to manage lists, to carry out actions on particular lists within the system, and that does include rollover as well. There is this bulk action menu on the top right over there, which you can see. That is actually controlled by an additional permission. Because we know that sometimes you might want library staff to have access to the list report to do particular functions that you've got in mind, but perhaps you don't want them to have access to the bulk actions that you can carry out over here. So this is actually controlled by an additional permission if you're someone that's got access to all lists and wonders why you can't see it. And as you can see, it allows you to make bulk changes in various ways. So you can set things to public or private, you can bulk archive, you can bulk publish. And of course, you can bulk rollover as well. So what you would be doing if you're doing a targeted rollover, you are going to use whatever criteria it is that you need to use to identify the lists that you want to roll over at this point. So you might do that through looking at lists with a particular list status. There might be lists with a particular title that you want to roll over if you've got a particular one in mind. You're probably going to be using a time period. So what I'm doing here, I'm saying, show me all the lists in the 23-24 time period. If I just pause that for a moment. I was talking earlier about how you can only roll lists over once. There is actually a column over here which will show you lists that have been rolled over once already. So that will give you a sense of which ones may actually need some action taken against them. Yeah, That's me just highlighting where they are. And then if we just move on a bit. One way that I suspect a lot of you will be doing this is by the hierarchy code. So obviously you will know your hierarchy codes better than I do, but it might be that all of the modules within a particular school start with a particular string of letters or numbers. So in this case, I've got a hierarchy code XYZ, where I happen to know that there are some lists attached to that particular area of the hierarchy. You can see I've got 3. It's showing me them at the bottom. And at this point, I can say, okay, which ones do I want to roll over? So I can either tick individual ones, or I can tick that box at the top of that column and select all of them and say, yes, these are the lists that I want to take action against. So all of those are now ticked. We're going to go to the action menu. We are going to choose rollover. And at this point, it functions pretty similarly to the other version of rollover. So you've got a screen pop up giving you your choices. This bulk action cannot be reversed. On completion, an email will be sent to your email address. We don't need to choose a source time period because we've already identified the lists we want to take action against through the all list report, but we are still going to need to specify a target time period. And of course, we've still got choices to make about whether our new lists should be draft or published, and whether we want to archive the old ones or not. So this part of the process is really very simple, similar. It's just how we identify the lists that we initially wanted to roll over. So I'm going to move those to 24, 25. Again, oh no, I'm not going to click on published. Yes, I am. And then I'm going to submit the job. And again, you can see there's a message at the top there. Your request has been submitted. You will be emailed when it's completed. And again, you can visit the review jobs page if you actually want to see how that's going. So requested means we've got it. And because this one was a very small job, you can see it quickly went to in progress. And then very quickly it completed. So that video is in real time. That's how quickly I was able to roll over 3 lists. And again, you get your job is 100% complete. And you're good to go. So that's your alternative route. You can do the big bulk rollover, or you can choose to do a targeted rollover and only choose selected lists that you want to roll over. There's a question here. Would you be able to explain what happens in Blackboard once reading lists are rolled over and detached from hierarchy and archived? Yes. So if a list has been attached via LTI, that list should stay linked. So, it's 23, 24, you've attached it by LTI, later you come to archive it, that link should still be pointing to the old version of the list. But of course, if you've rolled over, your new version of Blackboard, assuming you're using LTI 1.3, should then be pointing at the new version. And if you're still on the old version of LTI, of course, the links break during rollover anyway. Hopefully that answers your question. There are numerous support articles, which I will share some of them in the chat at the end of the session. But I do know there's a few questions that we often get at this point. So a common one is, how long will my rollover take? That will partly depend on how you have chosen to roll over. If you are setting up your lists, your new lists as draft, then you would expect the rollover to process about 1,000 of them an hour. So if you're rolling over 6,000 lists, you're rolling over to draft, you should realistically expect it to take about 6 hours. If you are publishing your lists at the point of rollover, it's about 500 an hour, Because if you think of it, there's two steps there. A, we have to copy the list, and then B, we actually have to publish it. So we're doubling the number of actions we're taking. So yeah, if you want to publish your new list, you're going to slow down the rollover process, but it might save you some time further down the road. But again, that's something you might want to factor into your thinking when you're doing this. So a common thing we see is that some universities will set the rollover running overnight. So, maybe you set it running at 5 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon. When you come in on Wednesday morning, it's complete. Other people like to monitor the progress through the day. So you might want to start the rollover running at 9 a.m. and then you're around for the next few hours while the rollover is completing, in case you want to keep an eye on it or what have you. Another common question we get is, can we go ahead with rollover without telling us at Talis? Well, yes, you can. We can't stop you from hitting the rollover button. As I say, though, it's a good idea to let us know, because we can give you a sense of whether any other institutions are rolling over on that day. And also it helps us, with institutions who, have said we're going to roll over on the 6th of June. And perhaps we say to you, yep, that's fine. We don't know of anyone else that's rolling over. And then when they come to hit it and it starts processing, it doesn't go immediately because another university has chosen to start their progress early. When that happens, we do have sight of the queues and we can look at them and give you an estimate of when your rollover job should be picked up. But yeah, it's a good idea to let us know if at all possible. Another question, should we check what the VLE time periods are and set our Aspire time periods to match those to help the LTI links? So any of you who have ever raised an LTI ticket will probably know that it ends up in the hands of our consulting team, as they are like the experts on this internally within TFS. All I would say to that is there should be a regex in place between the two systems, which will say, hey, this is 2324 here, and this is 2324 in Talis Aspire. If you've got different naming conventions, let us know what they are through the support ticket, and we should be able to advise on that and say this is how you need to set it up. Regex means regular expression. And I'm sure that there are people on this call that could explain it better than me, but essentially it's a way of converting the codes you have within your VLE into the codes that we have within Talis Aspire. Another common question we get is, what's the effect on the system while the rollover is running? Does it slow things down? The answer is no, it runs as a background job. So students that are using LIST can continue to click in, follow links. They're not going to notice any difference. It's just something that's running in the background. And the final sort of frequently asked question we get is, do the lists appear all in one go, or do they appear gradually as the rollover process is running? And the answer is it's the latter. So if you're running the process, you start running first thing in the morning. I want to create my 24, 25 time periods. If you go into the all list report an hour later, you might see that you've got 500 new lists in there, but the process is still running. And if you check back in another hour, you've got 1,000 and so on and so forth. So they appear within the system as they are created and not all in one lump at the end. Okay, a couple more things, and then I will pause for questions, although you have been asking them as we go, so I don't know if there will be too many. I need to say a couple of words about rollover and reviews. So best advice is, as it says at the top of this slide, we advise you to clear your reviews before you roll over. So in an ideal world, you will have no open reviews at the point you hit the rollover button. And there's good sense to that. When you're reviewing lists, you want to be reviewing the latest version. So you don't still want to be reviewing a 23-24 list at the point where you're creating the 24-25 ones. However, I have worked in a university, and I know that these things happen, that you get things submitted throughout the year. So there is a chance that you might still have some reviews open at the point that you want to do your rollover. If you're in that position, then there's a few things to be aware of. Oh, and there's a question from Amjad. Should we consider removing old time periods to keep it tidier, i.e. over 5 years old? It's a good question. The answer is it's up to you. From our point of view, there is no problem in you having multiple time periods within the system. We charge you on the number of students you have, not the number of lists you have within the system. So there's no issue with you having lots and lots of older lists within the system. Although, of course, you might end up with very long filters on some of your reports. But yeah, it's up to you. If you want to keep a record of lists going back 9, 10, 11, 12 years, there's nothing to stop you doing that. Or if you would like older time periods removed from your system entirely, we can do that for you. But just be aware that any lists attached to them will no longer have a parent, which makes it a lot harder to locate them if you need to dig them out later. There's also a question from Nick. Presumably open reviews with new lists should not cause any issues. No, Nick, they won't. If you've already started reviewing lists for 24, 25, and take my hat off to you if you have, then no, that shouldn't be an issue. So yeah, ideally you will be clearing your reviews before you roll over. However, if you don't manage to get to that position, then if you should archive your lists at the point of rollover, you can see, as it says there, where the list has an open review, the list will not be archived. So you've got lists ABC123, which has currently got an open review. You've chosen to archive all of your old lists. ABC123 will not be archived because there's still a review open on it. The system says, hey, there's some work going on here. So that's something you need to be aware of. As it says, though, the review for that list will also remain open. So you will be able to complete it, and maybe you want to archive it manually at that point. If you are archiving lists outside of rollover, so let's say you have you've chosen to keep your old lists and you want to archive those lists at the end of the summer because you just kept them up for resits or whatever, then the behavior is slightly different in that when you then archive those lists, if you still have a review open, then basically the review will archive itself. So essentially, what am I saying here? Yeah, so essentially the advice is any lists that you want to have archived, ideally you're not going to have reviews open on them. If you don't archive at rollover, if you keep all of your old lists, and any open reviews can be continued. There's also a common question we get from libraries that have the force review workflow in place. So for those of you that aren't familiar, that means that when a list is published by an academic, a review is triggered whether the academic has asked for it or not. And a common question we get is, if we have forced review and we want to roll over, are we going to accidentally trigger 2,000 reviews because we've rolled over to published and we've got this workflow in place? The answer is no. We are well aware that that would cause big problems for you. So we ignore the force review workflow when we are publishing new lists because we know that's going to cause a problem for you. Almost finished with the rollover side of things. Just to talk about LTI launch links as well. This is still quite complex because the majority of you have now are now using LTI 1.3, but we know that there are some of you that are still using the old version of 1.1. So if you are using the old version of LTI, you'll probably be well aware that at the point you roll over your lists in Talis Aspire, any links that you have set up within your VLE to point to Talis Aspire are going to break. That is not your VLE's fault. That is not Talis Aspire's fault. That is a limitation of that LTI standard. The advantage of moving to 1.3 is that when you then roll over your VLE and your reading lists, if you have set a link to a specific list or set a link to a specific section, those links will roll over with the system so that you don't have to reset them each year. So any of you that moved to LTI 1.3 last summer, this is the year when you will start to feel the benefit because you will not have to relink those items each year. If you haven't moved yet, it would be a good idea to try and get LTI 1.3 in place before you do your rollover so that you can then start to feel the benefit from next summer. And if you don't know how to do that, raise a support ticket with us and we will have that conversation with you. While we are talking LTI, I will just flag as well. Some of you may be aware that Chrome is making a change later this year to how it handles cookies. And that has implications for the LTI workflow that we currently have in place because it does partly rely on cookies, as do, many things that you do around the web. We are looking at developing a cookie-less solution for the LTI workflow so that when this update from Chrome comes, we're not going to be caught out by it. You will still be able to continue using your LTI linking. Our development team are looking at that at the moment, and there will be more details to follow soon. So if there are any of you aware of that sort of upcoming change to browser security, we know about it, we're on it, and we will give you details when they are available. I have one final thing to mention before I stop and see if there are any more questions and we move on to the digitization rollovers. Many of you will know that we've been talking for a while about making mandatory importances something that you can switch on within your Talis Aspire tenancy. It's still due for delivery in the next few weeks. We've made it part of the current reviews work which is going on because we know that for a lot of you, this idea of having mandatory importances is going to feed into your acquisitions workflow, because you make buying decisions based on the importances of list items. So this is going to hopefully be available late June, early July. It is still in the pipeline, but it may have implications for you depending on how you choose to roll over and when. So first thing to say, mandatory importances will be optional. You can decide whether you want your academics to have to set an importance on items or not. If you decide you do not want mandatory importances, you can probably ignore the next bit because it's going to have, you can just carry on exactly as you're currently doing and it's not going to have any impact on you. If mandatory importances are something that you do want to enable once they're available, you're going to need to factor that into your rollover thinking. So let's say you've decided we would like to switch this on when it's available. If you are rolling over to published, that's going to be sort of relatively low impact. Obviously, when your academics come in to make updates to their new lists, they're going to be confronted with this, you must set an importance against everything, and they will need to make changes. If you enable mandatory importances and you're rolling over to draft, basically what you're telling your lecturers is we want you to make updates to your lists before we set them live. But effectively, by having mandatory importances in place, you are also going to be giving them an additional step at that point, because they might sort of come to you and say, well, last year I just hit publish. Why do I now have to set importances against everything? Why are you giving me this additional piece of work? I know why you're doing it. It's because you want importances set to feed into your acquisitions workflow. But just be aware that you may need to have those conversations if you are rolling over to draft and you enable it in late June or early July. Because it's still not live in the system, that's probably all I can say at this point. But just be aware that those are conversations you may need to be having a few weeks from now. So next steps from here. Start to think about your rollover date, liaise with your LTI, so your VLE colleagues, liaise with us about what will be a good time so we can get it in our calendar. Notify us for a new time period set up if you haven't got one already. And as I say, this is your point to tell us when you're planning on rolling over. And of course, hopefully this has been useful, but there are multiple support articles available on our support website as well. And I will be dropping some of those into the chat at the end of the session. Does anyone have any questions at this point before we move on to the rolling over of digitizations? Okay, no question. Oh, okay, you're welcome, Sala. It's a comment from Nick. Useful refresher, I'm leaving now. Okay, that's fine. So Yeah, the rest of the session is really focused on rollover of scans. So if you're not using Talis Aspire copyright clearance or DCS integration, you can probably drop off at this point. Um, Although there is a question from Chantal, is there a good way to get emails for list publishers for comms? Yes, you go to the All User Profiles report, you filter to list publishers, and you export it to CSV, and they should all be in there. If a module code changes in the VLE, but we are using LTI 1.3, am I right in thinking LTI links shouldn't break? So any link that you have set up should maintain, but obviously as you look for the module in the next upcoming academic year, then that link is not going to happen. Does that make sense? I think I think that's what you're asking, but do drop a clarification in the webinar chat if it's not. Okay, so before we move on to scans, and I think some people are disappearing at this point, which is fine. We said you could. I am just going to give you a quick update on some upcoming events before all of you disappear. Just to let you know, there is a new product update webinar happening next month in June. There was a registration link in the last Talis Aspire newsletter, and there will be another one going up before then. And we will also send a reminder via a service announcement closer to the time. So to let you know that's happening. We will also be holding a reviews webinar sometime in the next few weeks. So hopefully those of you who are signed up to the mailing list will have noticed we've been doing a lot of releases relating to reviews lately. And there are still a few more planned over the next few weeks. I was actually reviewing one of them this morning. So what we are planning on doing, once all of those releases have been made, we will be doing a sort of comprehensive reviews webinar, reminding you of the process from beginning to end. This is how reviews works. This is what it's for. But we'll also be using that as an opportunity to showcase all of the new functionality that's already been released or is coming in the next few weeks. So if any of you are looking at your reviews processes at the moment, that webinar is going to be a good one to attend because it may sort of help you rethink how you're currently doing things. We haven't set the date yet because we're waiting for, for confirmation that all of the releases that are currently happening are out. But I would expect that to be late June and early July. But keep watching the newsletters for details. Right. Copyright clearance rollover, and we will touch on the DCS integration as well. So very high level summary. As you'll all know, users can also use Talis Aspire to make requests for digitized items, whether you're using our own copyright clearance or whether you're using the DCS integration. There is the ability for users to go to a book or an article within a list, click on request digitization and generate a digitization request. And then when you've processed that, it's hosted directly within the list. At the point when you roll your lists over, you're also going to need to roll your scans over to ensure that you are meeting your reporting obligations to the CLA. Because as you'll know, requests can only be made live for up to 12 months at a time for reporting purposes. So what we are going to look at, this will mainly be focused on our own copyright clearance system, because as I say, if you're using the DCS integration, most of the grunt work happens within the DCS. But we will touch on that briefly at the end. So what we're going to look at is the order of events, exactly how reading lists and copyright clearance interface with each other, and sort of the steps that you'll need to take. And again, we'll give you a demo. So the first thing I have to make absolutely clear, carry out your reading list rollover first. And the reason I say that is because if you think about it, you've got your 23-24 lists, you've also got your 23-24 scans. If you have not rolled over your lists, there is nowhere for your scans to roll over into. So assuming you are rolling over your reading lists, you should do that before you roll over any scans. So again, factor that into your thinking about when the rollover should happen. You've got to give your digitization team time to roll the scans over afterwards. As it also says on the middle point there, if you have chosen not to roll over in Talis Aspire reading lists, Talis Aspire copyright clearance has logic to support this. So essentially, if you don't roll over reading lists and you just choose to update your time periods, you can still roll over your scans, but there is an additional step you need to take each time, basically to confirm each rollover you do, yes, I'm happy to link this to the existing list item and not to the next year's. So once you've carried out your rollover, you can then move on to the copyright clearance rollover. We have been using this slide for a number of years, but I still haven't found a better way of actually explaining how the process actually works. So hopefully this will help you visualize what's going on. If you think about it, we start with our reading lists in 23-24. It may be that within that reading list, a lecturer has made a request for an item to be digitized, and that will form a request within Talis Aspire copyright clearance. So let's say that's 4022. And then attached to that request, you are going to upload your PDF, your bundle. So that's like the chain of events, if you like. We have a reading list, which has a request linked to it, which then has a PDF linked to it. At the point of rollover, you roll your reading lists over. We now have a 24-25 reading list over here. At this point, we are still going to point at the original scan, assuming that the date attached to it hasn't expired, because we're trying to, make sure that students have unbroken access to this for as long as it's available. So initially, your new reading list will still point to the original scan up until the point when it expires. But of course, as you know, it will expire because the CLA will only allow you to put scans up for 12 months at a time. So what you then need to do, you roll the scans over in the same way that you do the reading lists. So that scan goes from 4022 to request number 5000 or whatever it is in the back end of copyright clearance. It points to the same bundle, so you don't need to re-upload it each time. And then when the scan expires, it's going to disappear from the original reading list so that what you've now got is the same PDF, but with a new request number pointed at by the new reading list. So when I talked earlier about a chain going on behind the scenes, that's what I was talking about. We're making sure that as you create the new list and as you create the new scan, you are still pointing at the correct scan within your system. So that's the theory, if you like. That's what's going on when you are rolling over your scans. How it works, and I will demo this in a moment, you need to do some pre-clearance first. So when you come to roll over your scans, we do a series of checks against them to make sure that there is no issue with you having this scan available next year. We will do things like we will look for rollover date conflicts. So if you are rolling over a scan from a time period to a time period where the dates overlap, we will flag that with you at the point that you do clearance to say, is this what you meant to do? We will flag if you were trying to roll over a scan which hasn't actually started yet. So maybe you're dealing with large volumes of scans. I know that some of you roll over thousands every summer. Perhaps you've set your criteria to say, I want to roll over scans that meet these criteria. You haven't noticed that you're trying to roll over a scan which already has a start date in the future. We will flag that with you. And I'll give you some examples in a moment. We will flag with you if you're trying to roll over a scan where the reading list hasn't been rolled over yet. So as we said, you should really carry out your reading list rollover first. If the list hasn't been rolled over, and that happens for those of you that don't roll over reading lists, we will flag that with you. And then you can still link it if you want to, but you have been warned. We will flag with you if you are trying to roll over a scan where it's been deleted from a list. So this is quite a common one. A lecturer makes a request for a scan, you provide the scan for them. At some point during the academic year, they update their list, they delete that scanned item from the reading list and they don't tell you about it. At the point where you roll over, we will detect that and say to you, hey, this is not available on the list anymore. Do you still need it? Whenever you start running these checks, you will get an email, something like this. So this is an example, and this is an old one, where a colleague of mine attempted to roll over multiple scans in one go. And we give you an email summary at the end saying, yep, we've carried out all the checks that you wanted to do. Here are some issues that we determined would be a problem. So we will give you a summary of what's actually happened with the actions that you've carried out. But this will make more sense in a moment when I show you how it works. Things to bear in mind when you are rolling over scans. You have the choice either to pre-clear or edit and pre-clear scans that you want to roll over. Pre-clear literally just means I'm going to roll over everything exactly as it is, but I'm just going to choose the new start and end dates. Edit and pre-clear will allow you to do things like change the course numbers or change the course code. So maybe you've got a scan which is currently on course ABC123. That course has now been renamed and there are 20 more students taking it. This is your chance to make those edits at the point you do the rollover. And then once you've carried out sort of your attempts to roll things over, you will see a number of cues which will allow you to make any sort of actions you need to take against them. There's a slide here showing that, but honestly, it will probably just be easier to show you how all of this works. It is worth just flagging one other thing. A lot of people don't realize this. You can actually roll over individual scans directly from the request screen. So any of you that work with copyright clearance will be familiar with this screen. If you have a scan which is currently live and you just want to roll over one scan and don't want to go through the business of rolling over hundreds because you're in the middle of like your annual rollover, there is actually underneath the actions button up here an option just to roll over an individual scan. So I'm just sort of mentioning that because it's one that often gets missed. And if you're sort of doing them piecemeal as and when you get requests, that might be something that you want to consider. But this is all theory. It's really best just to show you how this works in practice. So again, I'm assuming if you've stayed on the call, you're probably reasonably familiar with this. But for those of you that aren't, here is a demo of how you go about rolling scans. Again, I'm doing this via video rather than live because by testing the behavior, I'm essentially doing the rollover, which means I'm always having to find examples that will behave in the way I want. So we're going to do a video of this at this point. So let me set this running. So this is Talis Aspire copyright clearance. You can see there is a rollovers menu up there. And there is a menu here sort of showing you various options. We'll talk through them in a moment. But what I'm going to start by doing is saying which scans are currently available for rollover. And the criteria we use for that are scans that are either available right now, so they're live, or they've expired in the last 4 months. So we know that sometimes there is a period where scans are down between academic years. We think 4 months is a reasonable sort of window to say, well, actually, this might be required again. So that's the criteria we use when you say, show me scans that are available for rollover. So this is our demo setup. As I said, I've only got 28 here. I expect some of you have got thousands. You can drill down those scans in any number of ways. So you might want to choose your CLA reporting period. You know, show me all the scans which are available for rollover in a particular CLA time period. So that's what I've sort of filtered on there. There were 18. Or you might want to filter on time periods within your setup. And I hope you haven't got as many as that on your own setup. So show me all the scans within 23, 24, and you can see it's populated the course start and end dates there because those have been drawn from the time period, which are available for rollover. One common way that we see institutions doing this is that they will actually choose a course code because you can attempt to sort of clear up to 200 scans at a time. But if you're rolling over thousands of scans, that can get quite messy. So what I'm doing in this sort of example is saying, please show me all of the scans that are attached to the ABC 001 course code. And so often what we see institutions doing is picking out all the course codes where they know that scans are available, and they work through them on a course by course basis. Depending on how many scans you have to roll over, that may or may not work for you. But that's the example that we're following in this instance. So again, I can choose one, or I can choose all scans that fit my criteria. This is when we can make the choice between pre-clear or edit and pre-clear. So pre-clear would just sort of run checks against all of those. It would carry forward the same course details, the same student numbers, or if I edit and pre-clear, I can edit those at a later date, as we'll see in a moment. So what I'm doing is I've clicked edit and pre-clear, and they've gone into a rollover queue. What we are doing at this point is we are running checks against those scans that I've selected for rollover for some of the criteria I mentioned earlier. You know, has the list it's attached to been rolled over? Has this scan already been rolled over before? That sort of thing. Because I'm rolling over 2 scans, this happens quite quickly. If you're rolling over larger numbers, this might take a few minutes at this point. But what's happened is you can see it's looked at those 2 scans, it's detected there are no problems. You know, the list has been rolled over. These scans haven't been rolled over before, they haven't been deleted from the list. So this is like the happy path, if you like. And so what I can do at this point, you can see there's an action option up there. If I did want to edit the details, because I chose edit and pre-clear, this is my opportunity to actually make changes to this. So I can say, okay, I'm rolling over the scan, but I want to change the course name or the course code or the student numbers. Or I don't want the start and end date to be 12 months on from last year. I want to make them different. So you have got all of those management options here if you want to reuse the same scan. I could remove it from the queue if there's a problem, but I don't want to do that. What I'm going to do, I'm going to highlight them both. And now what I'm doing is I'm sending them to clear for real. So I'm basically saying, yes, I want these to be made available for next year. And you can see there are numerous queues which have built up here. And if you're rolling over lots and lots of scans, you're probably going to end up with a screen something like this, whether you choose to do it or course code or not. So each of these queues are scans which are rolling over to the next academic year. And it's showing you whether action is needed or whether there's a review needed or whatever. This one is currently validating. Because it's only 2, it should go through quite quickly. And so what's happened is you can see it's referred 1 at the end. So that tells me that one of the items that I put forward has just rolled over. It's already live. It's on the list. The system has found that there is one item where I need to take action, and it's referred it because it's run exactly the same checks as it would make as if you were making a brand new digitization request. So, you know, is it covered by the CLA license, all of that. So it's showing me why the request was referred, because there is an existing electronic copy already available. There is the workflow to show you that it's run the same checks as it would make as if you were making a brand new request. So, you know, has it been found in the library? Does it pass the copy limit checks? Do you hold it? That sort of thing. And then what I'm going to do with this item, yeah, I'm happy with it. I'm going to source it from the electronic copy as I did last year. And at this point, it's just like dealing with any other digitization. So you can see it's currently still marked as in the queue. If I refresh it, it's now live. That queue thing has disappeared. And just to show you, that scan is now available. We sourced last year's copy from the vault, so you don't have to rescan it. We've got the details in the system already. And when we click on view item and reading list, just to show you, it's available to students and they can read it. So that's how a rollover is going to work. There's a comment here from Andrew. We have a nice rollover spreadsheet we make using a report from Talis Aspire Copyright Clearance and then roll them over one course at a time. So that's from Andrew from Worcester. And that was the example that I gave in my demo. I picked a course code, I rolled it over. As I say, you don't have to do it that way, but I personally think it's quite a neat way of keeping things in check. Just to show you, here were some of the other cues in that video. These are the sort of things that might get flagged up. So this one says action needed. Here are some of the things that you might encounter when you're doing a rollover. One request is linked to a reading list item that does not appear to have been rolled over. So you could filter by that. This is the one that hasn't been rolled over. And at this point, you could click on resolve and you can make a decision. What do you want to do? Do I want to link this to the current reading list? So I'm linking it back to where it's currently hosted and renewing it for another 12 months. And if you don't roll over reading lists, this is what you're going to need to do for each one. Or am I going to manually link it afterwards? So I'm going to roll it over anyway. I'm going to have the scan available, and then I will link it to a reading list at a later date. Or I could cancel it. And we've got one here. One request in queue is linked to a reading list item that has been deleted. So at this point, I'm going to remove it, or I can remove and archive it. So I am not going to work on that scan anymore. And then it's going to go back and revalidate the other ones I've done. If you went into Aspire and rolled the list over, would that error disappear? No, it wouldn't, because at the point where you've attempted the rollover, the link that you need to exist isn't there yet, so you'd have to manually do it afterwards. I'm guessing you haven't done this process before. I don't know that, but no, it wouldn't. So really, advice is do it. Do your reading list rollover first. So how all of this would work in practice? Really wish we had an option of automatically rolling over list digitized content every year. Amjad, that is a conversation we would need to have with the product team, because there are any number of variables that we would need to consider at that point. But I do take your point, and I can see you put a wink next to your comment. So, suggested timeline would be something like this. I think Andrew already mentioned this from Worcester. They actually export a course report from Talis Aspire Copyright Clearance, and they work through it module by module. Here are the rollovers we are going to need to do. Obviously, as you're working through those, things will be highlighted. So, okay, maybe we need to order a new editions for some of these, or maybe we need to update a scan or whatever. Where you have got things like, this has been deleted from a list, or you have identified there's a newer edition, you may need to liaise with your teaching staff to say, okay, what's the way forward here? A couple of things to finish. It's not strictly rollover related, but I will mention this at this point. Again, those of you working with Talis Aspire Copyright Clearance will know that in August each year, we need to run a thing called the UK Annual CLA Requirement Checks. This is something that the CLA asks us to do each year as a third-party technology provider. And essentially what it is at the beginning of August, we have to run checks against every scan that you currently have live in your system to ensure that it is still compliant with the CLA license for the next 12 months. To be honest, it's not as scary as it sounds. I'm going to read directly from what the CLA actually says. All digital copies made under the CLA license, irrespective of the time of rollover or the HEI's individual academic year, must be rechecked at the start of the HE license year, which runs from 1st of August to 31st of July in the first week of August each year. So this is essentially why we have to run this process every year, is because the CLA has determined that August is the point where we should do it. So it's not strictly part of rollover, but of course, a lot of you will be rolling over your scans around this time. You don't need to do anything. We will run these checks on your behalf. And what happens is, if we determine that any scans you currently have live are no longer covered by the license, and a typical reason for that would be a scan that you used last year is from a publisher where the publisher is now withdrawn from the CLA license. That's a sort of typical scenario. We will send a report to your system admin saying, here are scans that you need to take action on. But the reason I mention all of this is because you might find that you've rolled some scans over, I don't know, say in early June, and between you making them live for the next academic year and the CLA checks being run, perhaps that publisher has withdrawn from the agreement or something has changed so that a scan that was previously valid is no longer valid. What I would say is the closer you run your digitization rollover to the start of August, the less likely it is that there's actually going to be anything for you to action as a result of that report. But again, we will do comms around this closer to the time, and there are support articles available on our website. It's also mentioned on that slide, it doesn't matter if you're an organization that auto reports your scans or doesn't auto report your scans, we still have to run this process for you in August each year. Does that mean we should roll over scans before start of August? Not necessarily. You could run the checks in August and then do your rollover. And at that point, we're still going to be doing similar checks to the CLA checks anyway. So anything that the CLA check picked up as being a problem is also going to be a problem with any scans you raise after that. But this is a process that we have to run as a mandatory thing every year. The other thing to mention on this, we are very well aware that there is a change coming to the CLA license from the beginning of August, in that you will now be allowed to copy 2 articles or 10% from each journal issue, whichever is greater. We will, of course, be adjusting our system at that time because, of course, we need to be legally compliant. But I don't think that's going to cause any of you a problem with regards to the annual checks, because essentially you're going to be allowed to copy more than you previously were. So I don't see anything being excluded as a result of that. But again, more details will follow closer to the time. The available for rollover lists was up to 4 months expired. What happens to scans expired longer ago than that? Yep, that's a good question, Kathy. They will still be in your vault. So any scans that you have previously made available stay in your vault, so we've got all the details of them. So I know this happens sometimes where you have a course that runs 1 year, then it's rested for a year, then it comes back the previous year. So the following year, if you have previously used that scan, then probably the best way to do it would just be to make a fresh request for the content on the new version of the list. And once we've run all the checks, assuming it passes them all, we'll pick up the vault with your scan inside the vault and we'll just attach it immediately. So you won't have to rescan at that point. And just a word on the DCS integration to finish. Obviously, the DCS is not our system, but we do offer an integration with it. Kathy's got another question. Any way to identify these? Probably not something I could diagnose here and now, Kathy, but if you raise a support ticket with details of things you're interested in, we could have that conversation, certainly. Yeah, so with regards to those of you using the DCS integration, you will know that the DCS requires you to roll over all of your scans within the first 2 weeks of June. So we give you some flexibility over when you can roll over your scans. The DCS mandates that you must do your rollover within the first 2 weeks of June. There's a couple of things to say about that with regards to Talis Aspire this year. Previously, our advice had been you should either roll over Talis Aspire first and then the DCS, or you should have your DCS roll over first and then roll over Talis Aspire, and that you should keep that order going forwards. We have been looking at getting more flexibility into that workflow. And so we should now be at a point where if you did need to change that order for any reason, you should be able to do that. But if that is something that you're considering doing, so let's say you rolled over your lists first last year, then the DCS, now you would like to flip it, raise a ticket with us and we will have that conversation with you. The other thing to say about the DCS integration rollover is that we are making a change in how we handle rolled over scans from the DCS integration. So I asked the product team to sort of summarize this quite simply. And what they told me was, from now, all lists with digitization requests to the DCS will have links pointing to the latest active digitization. Previously, links had pointed to the earliest active digitization. This change makes digitization links in perennial courses more robust. So what we're thinking about here are the courses which maybe you're not rolling over from year to year, but you've got them in a long time period. And if you're making changes to those scans over time, then we're not necessarily pointing at the latest version. So essentially what's going on behind the scenes is that we should now be pointing at a later version of a scan rather than an earlier one. This will not change your students' access to digitized materials, and it does not affect your rollover processes. So, keep doing whatever you've previously been doing in previous years, unless you want to change the order, in which case, please tell us and we'll have a conversation. But it shouldn't actually change much about the way you do things. It should just mean that we're more reliably pointing at the latest version of a scan on next year's versions of reading lists. We have covered an awful lot of ground. We extended it by an hour to an hour and a half, and we've still run over. There is a question from Amjad. Do you have any update on when the British Library links will work again? Amjad, I wish we did. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, you'll know that we have an integration with the British Library API within copyright clearance, so that if you don't have some material that's been requested for digitization, you should be able to make a call to the British Library API, and you can actually request the item from the British Library there and then within Talis Aspire copyright clearance. We all know about the cyber attack on the British Library and that a lot of their services aren't currently available. As and when that service is made available, we will be restoring the link to it. But right now, it's the same for anybody that is using that API. We do not have access to it. Someone has answered your question, Amjad. At a recent meeting, they said they weren't expecting to get everything up and running before June 2025. Okay, that's not ideal. We have had support tickets from a couple of you who have said that you have been sourcing scans from other sources outside the British Library. How you should be reporting those is a very good question. So we have actually sort of been talking to the CLA, and I know that some of you have approached the CLA directly and said, this is what we're doing. How do we report this? If you are actually sourcing your scans from a different source, so I think it's called Article Galaxy or something like that at the moment, do raise a support ticket with us, because we have got a couple of live conversations going on around that at the moment, and we're very well aware that you need to be reporting to the CLA soon. So if you are using a substitute for the British Library, do let us know and we'll see what we can advise you to do. What I'm also going to do, I'm going to drop some links into the chat, or I would if my computer would allow me to copy them. Just bear with me. So what I'm going to do, there are some links going into the chat at the moment with support articles, which I think are relevant to what we've covered today. So there is one there talking about annual rollover of reading lists and copyright clearance. That's where all of our articles are hosted. There is an article going in which talks about the behavior of rollover and LTI 1.3 in different systems. So that's something that you might want to have a look at or share with your VLE teams. And there is also an article going in about the annual CLA requirement checks and what those entail and why we need to do them each year. Are there any final questions from anyone about anything we've covered today? I don't have questions for now, but I may have questions when I actually start the process. Should I email you if I have questions or if there is a ticketing service? Uh, yeah, Caroline, if you send an email to support@talis.com, that will reach our support desk. It might be myself that responds to it. It might be one of my colleagues in the operations team. But yeah, any questions around any of this, do raise a support ticket. We will walk through the process with you. Is there a registration link for those two webinars? There was a registration link for the product update in the last Talis Aspire newsletter, and there will be another one going out before it happens, so there will be a link in there as well. And we will also be sending out a registration link via service announcement closer to the time. There isn't one for the review session yet because we haven't actually set a date. What we are waiting to do is make sure that all of those releases with reviews I talked about have actually gone live, and then we will share the link. And Richard says we can expect a support ticket about new time periods imminently. Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. Okay, everyone. Thank you very much for your time. Apologies that we went over. If there are any further questions, do raise a support ticket with us. A number of you have been doing it already. If you do find yourself getting lost in rollover of scans, again, do raise a support ticket with us and we can advise further, or we may even hop on a call with you if we think that's necessary. And yeah, look forward to speaking to you all again soon. Enjoy the rest of your day.